John was commanded to measure the temple in Revelation 11. Isn't that strange? Do you know why or what this meant? Was it just God's way to prove that the theory of preterism is wrong? Well, it does do that, but obviously means much more than that. Nor did God ask John to do this because he wanted to find out how big it would be. I think God already knows that. This is the kind of deep question, then, that most scholars don't like to tackle. This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters, and you follow this channel because we do tackle questions like this, and dozens more to help you understand what the Bible says about the future we're about to enter. And as an added bonus in this video, you're going to discover that in this lesson, you'll find a giant clue, a massive clue as to how to read the book of Revelation. There is a structural clue here that will solve your problems about what happens where and what the order of Revelation is. It's a huge bonus, so make sure you watch for that as well. Chapter 11 of Revelation is the first shift in the book. In most of the first 10 chapters, the Apostle John is an observer of what happens. He sees things take place and he writes them down. Then he tells us what the symbols mean, and finally, what events happen after we see the symbol. This is a three-part instruction that he is given at the beginning of the book, Revelation 1:19. Write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are, or a much better translation is, what those things signify, and those that are about to take place after this. A three-part instruction. What he saw, what the symbols mean or signify, and then what events happen after the symbol shows up. This is what John is doing first 10 chapters. But at the end of chapter 10, John moves from being a passive observer to being an active participant in what is going on. He's given one command and then another. First, he's commanded to eat a scroll, the scroll that is in the hand of the magnificent angel, who most likely is the angel of the Lord or Jesus. But that's another story in another episode. In this episode, we're going to concentrate on the measuring. But the eating of this scroll actually is related to that, and that's why we're starting here. Now, this eating of the scroll is exactly what the prophet Ezekiel was asked to do with a similar scroll 500 years earlier. Prophets were often asked to take symbolic actions like this to demonstrate what the prophecy meant. So, John is beginning to assume the role of a prophet here. And this eating of the scroll, as we said, has significance to the measuring. So we're going to start here in Revelation 10, 8 through 10. Then the voice that I heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, Go, take the scroll that is open, so it's an open scroll, in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land. So I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll. And he said to me, Take and eat it. It will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth it will be sweet as honey. And I took the little scroll from the hand of the angel and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. So symbolically, John eats the scroll. He internalizes its message. This scroll was already open. What scroll is open in Revelation? The seven sealed scroll, right? So by eating it, John is explaining the meaning of that scroll, which is, has the seven seals on it. It's a massive part of Revelation, so he's explaining that. This scroll was written on both sides. It has two messages, one for the righteous, one for the wicked. There are two fates that are lived out. When John initially tastes the scroll as sweet, that's the reward of the righteous. And then he experiences it as bitter in his stomach, the punishment of the wicked. On that same day, the righteous are raptured before the throne of the Father and before the Lamb. In Revelation 7, 9 through 16, we see them in this wild celebration, sweet as honey. However, in the next chapter, we see the trumpet judgments begin. They are handed out to the seven angels, and they result in the wrath of God being poured out on the earth. The bitter taste that's in John's stomach. Okay, so that was the scroll. Then after this, John is told,
"And they say to me, 'You must again prophesy about many people and nations and languages and kings.' I was given a measuring rod like a staff. Then I was told, 'Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar of those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months.
Revelation 10:11 through 11:2. So an unnamed they commands John. Who are they? Well, probably the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, although it's not stated. And they tell John he has to prophesy again. It's a huge word, again. The question I asked myself when I read this the first time was, when did John prophesy before? The answer is the giant clue we've talked about earlier. So I recommend paying attention to this. John had been prophesying for the whole first half of Revelation. He had explained the seven seals and 6 of the 7 trumpets already. Now, he is being instructed to tell the story again, prophesy again. Tell the story of the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets, but this time, tell it differently. This time, he's going to tell the same story using characters like the 2 witnesses, the dragon, the woman, the beast, the second beast, etc. So that makes this verse probably the most important structural verse in the book of Revelation. If you have trouble understanding Revelation, this is why. John tells the story of the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets twice in 2 different ways. The first time, he tells it in Revelation 5 through 10 in terms of big events on the earth. The second time, he tells it in terms of the characters who will populate the end times. He does this in Revelation 11 through 15:5. 2 looks at exactly the same story. It is into this context, then, that John is given his measuring staff and told to go measure. It's the beginning of his prophesying again. This is exactly the same as his being told to eat the scroll, by the way. Both are symbolic acts, and the result is going to be the same. Sweet reward for the righteous, punishment for the wicked. Let's look at what he's told to do. Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. So it's the things and the people. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations or Gentiles, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. So he treats the 2 sections of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem differently. He measures the temple and the altar and the people who worship there. He doesn't measure the outer courts and the people who trample there. Just like the scroll is written on both sides, there are 2 fates here. One is measured, one isn't. So let's look at what measuring means in the Bible. And second, we're going to look at the significance of the Temple Mount, because that is the focus of the end times. The end time struggle between Satan and God the Father and God the Son. It's a struggle, in part, for the Temple Mount. Now, there are actually other examples of measuring things in the Bible and even in Revelation. And we're going to take a look at what some of those other examples might reveal about what's happening here. In Zechariah chapter 1 and 2, Lamentations chapter 2, Ezekiel chapter 40, and then again in Revelation chapter 21. That's a lot of measuring. For some of these measurements, the Bible gives us actual numbers, the size of the things that are being measured. For instance, in Ezekiel 40, an angel measures the glorious new temple in the millennial kingdom, and exact dimensions are given. The same is true for the New Jerusalem. It's measured in Revelation 21, and exact measurements are given for it. Staggeringly large measurements. These measurements with dimensions tend to show, that it's evidence that these structures will exist in the future. God said it, and this is how big they're going to be. But other measurements, like the one we're looking at today, have no numbers given. So, can the purpose of the two types of measurements be different? Those with distances and those without? Yeah, it can. An example of a measurement without distances is found in Zechariah 2, 1 through 5. And I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. And I said, "Where are you going?" And he said to me, "To measure Jerusalem, to see its width and what is its length." And behold, the angel who was talking with me came forward, and another angel came forward to meet him, and said to him, angel to angel, "Run and say to that young man, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as villages without walls, because of the multitude of people and livestock in it. And I will be to her a wall of fire all around, declares the Lord, and I will be the glory in her midst." So that kind of implies here also that this second angel maybe was the angel of the Lord. So in this case, measuring shows protection, God's protection. That's the real point. He'll be a wall around her, a wall of fire. And that latter meaning of protection seems to be what's implied by the measuring John does in Revelation. He measures part of the Temple Mount, showing God's protection, and he doesn't measure the outer part, showing that these are the ones who will suffer punishment, the ones who trample the city. This is the same basic idea as the scroll written on two sides. Two fates, reward for the righteous, punishment for the wicked. And the measuring also carries the meaning that a temple of some sort will exist in the end times. If you measure it, it will exist. And this is obviously a very real earthly temple, not a heavenly one. There are no Gentiles in heaven trampling the outer courts. And it isn't a spiritual temple either, Christians are the temple of God, because our hearts don't have outer courts where Gentiles trample either. It's a physical temple on the Temple Mount. Now let me just take a second to discuss preterists. We mentioned them earlier, and why the passage proves the whole preterism historicism idea to be wrong. The preterists say that Revelation was written prior to 70 AD and the destruction of a temple, and that this was actually Herod's temple, rather than around 95 AD, when the early church fathers say it was written. So rather than taking good, solid, historical evidence and testimony from the people who knew, preterists choose to use a passage like this to prove their point. They say this refers to John measuring the second temple, Herod's temple, that was destroyed in 70 AD. I'm sure, like me, you can see how foolish this opinion is. First, the people in the temple were not protected in any way, physically or spiritually, in 70 AD. Nor did the Gentiles trample the outer courts for exactly and only 42 months. So for multiple reasons, preterists can't use this measuring as a proof. It's actually proof against them. Okay, you might ask, how are people in the temple in the future going to be protected? How are those at the altar protected? The Antichrist, after all, is going to sit in the temple, and he's going to stop sacrifices. So it isn't some kind of physical protection, is it? I had to ask myself this same question. Where else is the altar found in the book of Revelation? The altar of sacrifice in heaven, under which the martyrs wait for God's redemption. So this is in a way a picture of spiritual protection and reward for the righteous, eventual reward, living and dead. If you have other ideas, let us know in the comments, but it seems to be a picture of that eventual spiritual protection, which is really what matters, not the short-term physical protection. The trampling issue brings up several other major points. One is that the tribulation period is at its core a struggle for the Temple Mount, and specifically the Holy of Holies and the foundation stone now in the Dome of the Rock where the Ark of the Covenant once stood. Psalm 2 discusses this struggle. The nations rage and plot against the Lord and his Messiah. They do this by physically occupying the Temple Mount with their false Messiah, the man of sin who's going to sit in the temple and who's going to rule and have authority for 42 months. But here's God's answer. Psalm 2, 4-6. He who sits in heaven laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king, and that's Jesus, on Zion, my holy hill. So God is setting his king Jesus on the Temple Mount after he returns. The trampling is only 42 months. 42 months is a unique time period, by the way. Why didn't God say 1,260 days, which is probably pretty equivalent, like he does in other places? One is it's the same length of time that the Antichrist is granted authority. God is showing that he has specifically delineated what the Antichrist can do and the time he is allowed to sit on God's holy mountain. God is still in complete control, even in the Great Tribulation. Second, it prevents some kind of day for a year theory from developing, where people want to say that 1,260 days are years, 1,260 years. You can't do that with months, so saying 42 months prevents that type of theory. Now, after measuring, the very next verse in Revelation shows God's short-term plan for those 42 months. He's going to send 2 witnesses. And the measuring places them geographically where they will minister, in and around the Temple Mount. Remember, the struggle is for the most holy spot on earth, where God has placed his name. Click right here to learn who the witnesses are, what they do during their 1,260 days, and what is their relationship to the rapture, if any. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.